I'd kept the Halcyon's tally book for going on 30 years by the time I'm telling you about, and I'll say it straight at the start so you'll trust the rest. I never once wrote down the thing that mattered most about the year of 1884. A ledger holds cattle. It holds coin and the price of nails, and how many head went to the fall market, and how many the wolves in the winter took. It does not hold the sound a coach makes coming up the Sweetwater grade on a hard, bright afternoon, with the one soul aboard who is going to walk into a house of stone, and without ever meaning to, break a grieving man's heart back open and teach it to beat again. But I remember it. An old man forgets where he put his hat and remembers a thing like that whole and entire. I was leaning on the top rail of the round corral with a green colt's lead rope burning a line across my palm, and Elias Teague was beside me with his hat pulled low against the light, and neither of us said a word as the dust came up off the road below the house. The whole country could see that coach for 2 miles before it got to you. That's the kind of country it was. Big and bare and honest, and it hid nothing, and it forgave nothing, and it had already made up its mind about the woman inside that coach before she'd so much as set a boot on the ground. "There she is," young Prout said, from the fence behind us, and he said it the way a man says there's the funeral procession, low and sorry and a little bit glad of the show. Teague didn't answer him. He'd advertised for a wife, the way a man signs a note he already knows he'll come to regret grimly, in the dark, and only because the winter had finally got so far down into his bones that the silence of the house was worse than any shame the doing of it might cost him. 3 years his Ruth had been in the ground up on the little rise east of the house, her and the child that had come too early and gone with her, and in those 3 years I had watched as hard a man as ever forked a horse go slowly and completely to stone. He'd stopped eating at his own table. He'd taken to sleeping in the barn, out in the tack room on a cot no better than a hired hand's, because the bed in the house still had her shape in it somehow and he could not lie down in it. He did his work. He did more work than any 2 men. And he did not laugh, and he did not weep that any of us ever saw, and he let the house go the way a grieving man lets a thing go, which is to say he let it die a little every day and never once looked straight at it dying. So he'd put a notice in a St. Louis paper. A practical woman, it said. A widow, maybe, past the age of expecting much. Someone who could keep a house and cook a meal and not want the moon out of a man who had no moon left to give. That was the whole of what he wanted, and it was an honest and a modest and a mean little want. The want of a man protecting the last live coal of himself from any wind that might either put it out or, worse, fan it up again. What came up the Sweetwater grade that afternoon was not what he'd bargained for. And every man on the place saw it in the same breath. The coach stopped down by the yard gate. The driver hauled the brake and climbed down, and he opened the door, and out into the wind-scoured light stepped the finest-dressed woman the Sweetwater Reach had ever laid eyes on. She wore a traveling dress the soft gray-brown of a dove's wing, cut clean and cut well, the kind of dress that costs money in a city and means nothing at all up here except this woman does not belong. She wore gloves. Gloves on that road, with the dust the wind kicked up sanding at everything that moved. Her hat had a bit of a veil to it, and she had one hand up holding it against the wind, and her boots, I marked the boots first, the way you'd mark a lame foot on a horse. Her boots were town boots, thin in the sole, made for a boardwalk and a swept church aisle, and not one honest lick of use in that country. She stood a moment beside the coach with the wind taking at her skirts and her hat, and she did not shrink from it. That was the first thing, though I didn't rightly credit it at the time. The wind up there will bully a body, and most folks new to it flinch and pull in on themselves. She didn't. She stood square in it and lifted her chin and looked out over the whole of the reach, the high brown grass running a mile down to the lake lying pewter-colored and enormous under the sky, the mountain standing up white-shouldered behind it all, and the sky itself bigger and emptier and more merciless than any city person has ever once believed a sky could be. She looked at it the way you'd look at the ocean if you'd spent your whole life being told the ocean was a made-up thing. and behind her the driver and his man had gotten a trunk down off the boot, and it took the both of them to do it, grunting, and I knew before ever the latch was thumbed what was inside it. Nothing that heavy is clothes. I'd loaded enough freight in my life to know the dead particular weight of it, and I said to myself, before I'd even thought it through, books. That trunk is full of books. It was. We found that out soon enough, and it became a thing the whole country laughed about for a while. But at that first moment nobody laughed but Prout. Prout laughed. He was young, not yet 20, and he hadn't learned yet that a man ought to hold his judgments the way he holds a hot branding iron, carefully and not too long. He laughed, one short bark of it, and two of the other hands caught it off him the way a yawn passes down a line of tired men, and the sound carried out across the yard, the way sound carries in that thin high air, clean and cruel and a good deal louder than the laugher meant. "She won't last one winter," Prout said, still grinning, wiping his mouth. "Look at her hands, Harlan, look at them boots. She'll be on the down coach inside a month, mark it, and cryin' the whole way to the railhead." I didn't laugh. I'll give myself that much and no more, because God is listening, and I'll not lie to you. I didn't laugh, but I thought it. I thought it plain, and I thought it complete. I looked at the gloves and the thin boots and the two men wrestling that trunk of books, and in the honest privacy of my own hard old head, I wrote that woman off as neat and final as a man draws a line through a debt he's given up on ever collecting. Won't last one winter. I'd have signed my name to it. Teague walked out to meet her. I'll give him more than I gave myself. Whatever was moving behind that stone face of his. He walked out square and unhurried, and he took off his hat to her, which was more plain courtesy than he'd shown any living soul, man or woman, in 3 long years. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Teague." Her voice was steady. That was the first thing I truly noticed. When I drifted close enough on the pretext of the colt to hear it, the voice didn't shake, though the wind was doing its level best to snatch the words right out of her mouth and carry them off to the mountains. "You're taller than your letter led me to expect." "A letter's got no height to it," Teague said, which, for Elias Teague, was about as near to humor as the man came in those days, a dry little turning of the words. She didn't smile at it, but I saw something in her eye catch it and turn it over and set it away somewhere careful, the way a body pockets a coin they mean to look at closer by better light. I didn't understand yet that I was watching a woman who caught everything, who let nothing past her, who had made a whole life out of noticing the things other people threw away unnoticed. Teague looked at the trunk. He looked at the gloves. And I watched the cold come down over him like a shutter dropping over a lit window, because Elias Teague had looked at all that city finery and arrived, in the space of about 4 seconds, at the very same verdict Prout had brayed out loud. Only Teague had a great deal more riding on the verdict, and so he did not bray it. He went quiet and he went cold, and he got ready to do the hard practical thing, the merciful thing as he saw it, the thing that would spare them both. "I'll be honest with you," he said, "seeing as we'll neither of us come out ahead by the other kind. This is hard country, Miss Vane. Harder than a paper notice can say, and harder than a person from the city can rightly picture standing on a train platform 2,000 miles off. I wrote for a working woman. And I don't think," and here he stopped, and the wind rushed in and filled the gap he'd left, and I watched him make himself pick the sentence back up and finish it, because he was a man who finished things. "I don't think you're what I wrote for. That's no fault in you. It's a plain matter of fit, like a saddle. I'll pay your passage back, every cent and something over for your trouble. There's no shame in it, and I'll see it spoken of that way. The down coach comes through Thursday." I have turned that moment over in my hands a great many times in all the years since, the way you'll turn over a smooth stone you carried home from some particular day. How close it came. How near the whole rest of everything came to simply not happening. Thursday was 3 days off. And a lesser woman, a softer woman, the very kind the whole place had already decided down to the boot soles that she was, a woman like that takes that offer, and takes it gratefully, and is on the Thursday coach with her books and her gloves and her wounded pride. And the halcyon goes right on being a house of stone with a stone man rattling around inside it until the day they dig him a hole up on the rise beside his Ruth. It could have gone that way. It very nearly did. Adaline Vane looked at Elias Teague for a long moment. The wind pulled at her veil, and then, slow and deliberate, she reached up and drew off one glove, finger by finger, and she held out her bare hand to him, not to shake, mind, but to show. Turned it in the light so he had to look at it. And I saw what Teague saw, because I drifted close enough by then that I couldn't have not seen it. That hand was not soft. There was an old burn scar laid along the outside edge of it, pale and shiny, the particular scar you get from a hot stove or a hot iron handle you've gripped 10,000 mornings without a mitt because there wasn't time to find the mitt. The fingers were stained ink, worked so deep into the creases and around the nails that no scrubbing this side of the grave would ever lift it, the mark of a person who had spent a life with a pen. And the nails were cut short and blunt and plain, a working woman's nails, not a lady's at all, and there was a callus ridged along the side of the middle finger where a pen had rested day after day after day for years and years. My father was a bookkeeper, she said. She said it quietly, but the quiet of it carried better than a shout. In Missouri, a good one and an honest one, which is a harder combination than folks credit. When his eyes began to fail him, I kept his accounts, because there was no money for a clerk and no son to do it. When his hands began to shake so he couldn't hold the pen, I wrote his letters and I made his figures, and I did it well enough that not one of his clients ever knew the old man's eyes and hands had gone, which was the thing he feared most in this world. When he died, I settled his estate and I paid his debts, all of them, to the last cent, and I did it alone, because by then there was no one left. I have buried a father and a mother and a brother, Mr. Teague. She said it flat and even, no bid for pity in it, just the ledger of her life laid open. And in all my days, I have never once had the luxury of being what people took me for at a glance. People have been taking me for soft and useless my whole life, on account of I keep myself neat and I read books, and I do not care to argue with them about it in the street. She drew the glove back on, finger by finger, unhurried, calm as a Sunday. I did not come 2,000 miles to turn around and take the Thursday coach. I came to work. You may well find me unequal to the work. This is your country and I don't yet know it, and I'll not pretend I do. But you will find that out, sir, by watching me fail at it, not by looking at my boots. Nobody said one word. The wind said it all. It came up off the lake and combed through the high grass with a sound like a slow, indrawn breath, and it was the only sound in the whole wide afternoon. Prout had stopped grinning, and Teague, I watched a crack run right through the stone of him, a hairline, just for the space of a heartbeat, there, and then shuddered over again. Teague put his hat back onto his head and said, "Harlan will show you the house." And that was every word of it. He didn't say she'd stay. He didn't say the Thursday offer was withdrawn. He said Harlan will show you the house, and he turned on his heel and walked back toward the barn, and he left the whole rest of the matter for the country to decide. The country and the winter that was coming on. I showed her the house. It wasn't much to show, and I was some ashamed to show it, though the shame wasn't rightly mine. Teague had let it go the way a man in grief lets a thing go, not from meanness, but from a kind of blindness, the way you'll walk past a broke gate for a year, because to fix it, you'd have to first admit it's broke. There was dust standing in the corners thick enough to write your name in. There were dead flies on the windowsills from summers past. And there were Ruth's things still, everywhere and untouched. A woman's shawl hung on the peg by the door, gone gray with 3 years of dust, but still hung there like she'd be back off the porch any minute to take it up. Her sewing basket set by the cold hearth with a bit of mending still in it. A shirt she'd never finished. A row of little jars on a shelf, gone to God knew what inside, that she'd put up her last summer alive. Adaline Vane stood in the middle of that front room and took the whole of it in, the dust and the neglect and the grief, all three, because they were all three written right there on the walls, plain as paint for anyone with eyes to read. And she did not say one word about any of it. Not one. She didn't cluck over the dust, and she didn't go soft-voiced over the shawl, and she didn't ask me the questions I could feel her not asking. She set down the small carpet bag she'd carried in herself. She wouldn't let me take it, and she took off her hat and her gloves and rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and she asked me two things only: where the water was, and where the wood was. By the time the men came in off the range at dusk, tired and cold and expecting nothing but the usual my own poor bachelor cooking, a cold house, Teague eating alone and grim at the end of the table. By the time they came in, there was a fire going in that dead hearth. There was the floor swept clean, corner to corner. There was a lamp lit, and the chimney of it wiped so the light came through clear instead of murky. And there was coffee. Real coffee, hot and black and strong enough to trot a mouse across, and a pan of biscuits set out on the table, and those biscuits were, I'll not lie to you even now to protect an old man's pride, those biscuits were a very great deal better than anything I had managed to put on that table in 3 years of honest trying. The men came in and stopped in the doorway, all of them, and looked at the fire and the swept floor and the lamp, and looked at the woman with her sleeves rolled up pulling the last pan out of the oven, and not one of them knew what to say. Prout ate 4 biscuits. 4. And when he'd done he didn't say a word about the down coach, not that night. He looked once sideways at Adaline Vane while she wasn't watching, and there was the beginning of something in the look that was not laughter, and he went back to his food and kept his own counsel, which for Prout was a considerable feat. But a good pan of biscuits does not turn a country's whole mind, and it surely did not turn Teague's, and I'd be lying to you if I made it out that easy. Teague came in late that first night, after the others had eaten, and he took his plate at the far end of the table the way he'd taken it for 3 years, in silence, looking at nothing. He said thank you, ma'am, over the food, which was more than he'd said to me over any meal in a year, and when he'd finished he got up and put his own plate in the wash-water and went out to the barn to sleep on his hired man's cot. Same as ever. He gave her the house and he took the straw for himself, and every soul on the place knew the shape of the arrangement and not one soul remarked on it. He was courteous to her. He was distant as the mountains. And he watched her the way you watch a young horse you've not yet decided to trust, sidelong, waiting on the buck, waiting for the finery and the softness to show itself out, and the woman to break and cry and beg for the coach after all. She didn't buck. That's the thing none of us was the least bit ready for, myself first among them. She just went to work. By the end of that first week she had learned where every tool and pot and length of rope on the place belonged, and had put every one of them there. And God help the man who left a thing lying. She'd hand it back to you without a word, and there was something in the not saying that shamed a body more than any scold. By the end of the second week she was up before me in the black cold morning, and I'd prided myself the best part of my life on rising before the Lord himself was rightly awake. She couldn't rope. She couldn't ride worth the mention of it, not at the start. She'd never sat a horse before in her life, and she said so, flat, no shame in it. But here was the queer thing, the thing that was the whole key to her if you had the wit to see it. She was not proud in the one way that gets a person killed in that country, which is the way of a body too proud to admit what they don't know. She'd walk straight up to the thing she couldn't do, and she'd ask the youngest, greenest hand on the place to teach it to her, and she'd stand quiet and she'd watch and she'd listen, and then she'd do it, clumsy the first time and better the second and near right the third, because whatever else that laughed at trunk of books had done to her, it had built her a head that took a thing in once and did not let it back out. Inside a month she could sit a gentle horse and not fall off it. Inside, too, she could saddle her own and had a hand in the milking and the poultry, and had taken the whole of the house so far in hand that it was, of a sudden, a place a man wanted to come into out of the cold instead of a place he endured. She'd taken down Ruth's dusty shawl one day. I saw her do it, careful, both hands, and she'd washed it clean and mended the moth hole in it and folded it away in the cedar chest, gentle as you'd handle something in a church, not thrown out, not made a show of, just laid to rest, kindly. She did the same with the little jars and the sewing basket. She never once said a word to Teague about any of it. But the house stopped being a graveyard, room by room, so slow you couldn't catch her at it. And I think that was the first knife of it that got in past the man's stone, though it was months yet before he'd have owned to feeling it. And then there was the ledger. Now I told you at the start that I kept the Halcyon's books, and I did for years, and I kept them honest. But I'll tell you the true shape of it, which is that I kept them the way a foreman keeps books, which is to say I knew cattle and I knew work and I knew men, and I did not overmuch love a column of figures and never had. Teague himself had had no heart for the book since Ruth, and before her it had been her doing entirely. She'd had the head for it, so between her dying and the day I'm speaking of, the Halcyon's accounts had gone the way of the house. Not crooked. I want that plain. Just tired. Just tended slack and grudging by a man who'd sooner be horseback in a blizzard than sat at a table with a pen, which was me. Adaline asked to see them one evening in the back end of September. She asked it careful, and she was careful to say it wasn't to meddle. It was, she said, to know where she stood, seeing as she was living and eating on the place and had a right and a wish to understand its business. Teague, who had by then arrived at the notion that the safest thing all round was to let the woman do whatever she pleased so long as it kept her occupied, and out of the raw grief he still guarded like a wound, said she could look at them if she cared to. He said it the way you'd hand a fretful child a thing to keep it quiet, not unkind, just not crediting it with any weight. She took the books and a lamp and she sat up with them. The first night till past midnight I saw the light. The second night the same. The third night I came out for a dipper of water near 1 in the morning and the light was still burning under the door, and I stood a moment in the cold and I thought, the woman'll ruin her eyes and for what, and I went back to bed. On the fourth morning she was already sitting at the table when the men came stamping in for breakfast, and she had a single sheet of paper laid square in front of her, covered edge to edge and top to bottom in that fine close bookkeeper's hand, columns of it, neat as print. And when Teague came in and had sat and taken up his cup, she said, into the ordinary morning clatter, in that voice that did not shake, "Mr. Teague, you are being robbed." The room went dead still. A fork stopped halfway. Teague set down his cup slow and looked at her down the length of the table. "By whom?" he said. And I want you to sit with what he said because I've never forgotten it. He did not say, "Are you certain?" He did not say, "What would you know about it, woman?" He did not laugh it off. He said, quiet and level and dangerous, "By whom?" And in those two words I understood, all in a rush, that somewhere across those weeks of watching her not break, the man had commenced, against his own stubborn will and every intention he'd started with, to take Adaline Vane entirely seriously. "By your stock buyer," she said, "Coleman." Now Coleman was a smooth, heavy man out of the railhead town who bought most of the beef off most of the ranches on that whole stretch of the reach, and had for years, and was thick as you please with everybody and stood drinks, and was godfather, I believe, to a child or two among the smaller outfits. A trusted man, a known man. That was the whole of his weapon, though I didn't see it yet. "Tell it," Teague said. And she told it, and she told it the exact way I've since imagined she must have walked her blind old father through his own accounts 100 times, patient, plain, no showing off, no triumph in it, just the figures laid out one after another so a man couldn't help but follow. She turned the paper so he could see it, and she moved her ink-stained finger down the columns. "You sell to Coleman every fall," she said. 400 head near enough this year and each of the 3 years back that the books cover. He takes delivery at his own yard at the railhead. He weighs your beef there on his scale at his yard by his man's hand, and he pays you off the tally that his scale gives. You've no scale of your own out here to check it against. No one out here does. So you take his weight on faith because he's Coleman, and everyone takes his weight on faith because he's Coleman." Her finger moved. "Here is your own count of head going in that Harlan wrote down each fall, good count, honest count. Here is the paid weight that came back from Coleman's scale. Now, a steer of the kind you run ought to pay out within a known range of pounds. I've worked the average off your own 3 years of numbers, so it's your cattle I'm judging by, not some book's notion of a cow. And every single year, Mr. Teague, Coleman's weights come in light. Not wildly, not so a busy man would ever catch it. A little each head. 10 pounds here, 15 there, never enough to squint at on any one animal. But you don't sell one animal, you sell 400. And a few light pounds on 400 head at the price beef fetched those years. Her finger stopped at the bottom of the column, at a figure she'd ringed twice, comes, across the 3 seasons the book's cover, to better than $900. 920 near as I can make it. Shaved off you a handful of pounds at a time, because no one on this whole reach keeps the kind of book that would ever lay the 3 years side by side and catch it. And Coleman knows that. That's his whole game. He isn't a bold thief, he's a patient one. $920. By brother, I don't know as you can rightly feel at this distance what a sum that was. That was not pocket money. That was the difference, in a bad year, between an outfit that came through the winter and an outfit that went under and got bought up cheap by its neighbors. That was 2 years of a hand's wages. That was a killing, quiet, taking a few pounds at a time out of the mouth of a grieving man who trusted too tired to check. Teague looked at that sheet of paper for a long, long while. The whole table sat silent and let him. And then he raised his eyes to her, and I had known the man 20 years, and I swear before God I had never once seen on his face the thing that was on it in that moment. It was not simple gratitude, though there was some of that. It was more the look of a man who has been walking a long time alone in the dark, sure of his footing and secretly not sure at all, and who feels, of a sudden, a hand come and take him steady by the elbow. "You found this," he said, "in the books." "It was always in the books," she said. "Books don't hide things, Mr. Teague. People only stop reading them." He rode into the railhead that same afternoon, and he took the sheet of paper folded in his breast pocket, and he took me along, though I mostly held the horses. What passed between Elias Teague and Coleman inside that yard office I had only the second hand of. I heard voices go up once, the one smooth and then not smooth, and Teague's never rising at all, which with Teague was the worst sign of the two, but I can tell you what came out of it. Coleman never shaved the halcyon another pound. Coleman, in point of fact, wrote Teague a bank draft that very day against a portion of what was owed, rather than have the sheet of figures shown round to the other outfits he bought from, which would have finished him on the reach entire. And Teague, who could have finished him and by rights should have, took the draft and the promise of the rest and let the man keep his standing, for the time, not out of mercy, I think, but because a public war with the buyer everyone used would have cost the halcyon more in the short run than it gained. That was Teague, cold and long-headed even in the right. Word got round anyhow, the way it does. It got round that the widow Teague had married off a newspaper, the soft city bride, the one who wouldn't last a winter, had sat up 4 nights with the ranch books and caught Coleman the buyer bleeding the halcyon in plain figures where 3 grown men and a foreman had missed it for 3 years running. And I'll tell you the exact moment I knew the country's mind had commenced to turn, for good and all. It was the day Prout got himself into a fist fight over her. He was at the mercantile in town, young Prout, and some fellow from another outfit made a remark. The usual remark, soft city woman, won't see spring, playing at ranch wife, and Prout, who not 2 months before had brayed that very thing across the halcyon yard himself. Prout knocked the man clean off the porch and got a black eye and a split lip for his trouble, and came home grinning through the blood like it was Christmas. He'd not have owned to why for $100. But I knew why, and so did every man on the place, and nobody teased him for it. That is how a country's hard mind gets turned. Not all at once, not by any grand thing. 1 pan of biscuits, 1 column of honest figures, 1 bloody nose taken in the mercantile by a boy who was ashamed of himself and putting it right the only way he knew. A little at a time, the way Coleman stole, only the other direction. But Teague's mind, Teague's heart, which was the true fortress, that was harder ground than any of it, and it did not fall to biscuits or to figures. It took the winter to break Elia's Teague open, and the winter, when it came, very nearly took a good deal more than that. The storm came in October, which is early even for that high country, and it came the way the true killing ones always come, dressed as its own opposite. It came behind a morning so warm and so still it lied to you with every breath. I remember Adaline standing out on the porch that morning early, with a cup of coffee going cold in her 2 hands, looking down toward the lake, and she said to me, quiet, the way she said most things, "Harlan, where have the cranes gone?" For every fall of my life on that reach, the sandhill cranes had staged on that high lake by the thousands in the back end of the year. Great gray birds tall as a child, come down out of the north to rest on their long road south, and their calling, a rolling, rattling, wild bugle of a sound, 10,000 of them at once, was the very voice of the country in the fall, the sound you fell asleep to and woke to for weeks. And that morning the lake lay flat and pewter and empty, bare, silent. Not a bird on the whole broad water. She'd noticed it, the way she noticed everything, because she had gotten so she loved to watch them, would stop her work in the yard and stand a minute with her hand shading her eyes when a wave of them came off the water calling. I looked at the empty lake, and I looked at the sky, which was that flawless deep hard blue with not a rag of cloud in it, and warm, too warm, and I did not like it. I did not like it one bit. "They've gone on ahead," I said. "They know a thing we don't yet, ma'am. The cranes always know first." And I meant it light, but it didn't come out light. By noon, the temperature had fallen 40 degrees. I've watched it happen 100 times in that country, and it has never once stopped being a fearsome thing. The warm, still blue died into a low iron gray racing up out of the northwest, and the wind came around and came up and came mean, and by 3 in the afternoon there was snow in it, and by dark there was nothing in the whole world but snow, a whiteout, a screaming sideways white nothing so thick a man could stand at the house and not see the barn, could not see his own hand at the end of his own arm if he threw it out into it. A blizzard, a true one, the kind that kills. And we had 200 head down in the low pasture by the lake, and we had 2 men out with them who had not come in. Dunmore and Prout. They'd ridden down after the noon meal to move that low bunch up to the near pasture and the windbreak before the weather, which was the right call. Only they'd made it an hour too late because the warm morning had lied to them same as it lied to everybody. And now they were out in it and they had not come back and the dark was down and the storm was full and screaming, and any fool could reckon what an hour in that would do to a man, let alone a night. Teague was pulling on his heavy coat by the door with his face set like the mountains, and I was hauling on mine right beside him. No word needed between us, we were going, and that was the whole of the discussion. And it was Adaline who stopped us, not to keep us in. She never once tried to keep us in, and I loved her a little for that, right there, in a way that had nothing of romance to it and everything of respect. She knew men had to go do the thing that had to be done, and she did not stand in the door and weep and wring her hands and make it harder. She stopped us to make us go smart. She'd already been into the cedar chest and Ruth's old trunk and dragged out every wool thing in the whole house, Ruth's things, that she'd so carefully laid to rest, brought back out now without a flicker of hesitation, because there were living men freezing, and the dead do not begrudge their sweaters to that cause. She had 2 flasks filled with coffee scalding off the fire. She had 4 lanterns lit and their chimneys clean, and she wrapped 2 of them in sacking so the glass wouldn't shatter cold to hot. She had a coil of good rope, and she said, fast and clear while she was working, "You will not find that pasture by looking. No man could in this. The instant you're 20 feet off this porch you'll have no more notion of up country from down than a blind man in a barrel. So don't look. Take the drift fence." She meant the long straight fence line that ran from near the house clear down to the low pasture by the lake. I'd strung the most of it myself, years back. Get your hand on that wire at the corner post there and keep it on the wire and walk it down, hand over hand, and it will carry you straight to the cattle and to the men, because that's where the fence goes. And when you want home again, you turn around and you put your hand back on that same wire and it walks you home. Don't ever once let go of it to try a shortcut across open ground. Not for anything. The fence is the only thing out there tonight that knows where it's going. Trust the fence and don't trust your own eyes, because your eyes will lie to you in that and lead you out into the middle to die. It was the plainest, coldest, smartest thing anyone said that whole black murdering night. And it was said by the soft city bride the entire reach had sworn on a stack of Bibles would not last one winter, said while she cinched a scarf around Teague's neck with her own 2 hands and jammed a flask into his coat, brisk and hard and unafraid. And I saw Teague look down at her doing it, just for the 1/2 second he could spare. And I saw the look, and I knew even then, in the doorway and the roar of it, that whatever was left of the man's stone had a great crack running clean through it now. We took the fence. We went out into that, and I will not dress it up for you. It was the worst hour of my long life, and I've had some. The cold was a living thing that hated you. The wind stood you up and shoved you and screamed in your ears till you couldn't have heard a shout from a foot off. And the snow came so hard and so flat you'd have drowned in the air if you'd faced into it wrong. But we had the wire. We got our gloved hands on the top wire at the corner post and we followed it down, hand over frozen hand, one post to the next, leaning into the dark. And the fence carried us just exactly as she'd said it would, straight and true, down and down toward the lake, while the whole rest of the world was one white scream that wanted us dead. And the fence brought us to the cattle. We heard them before we half saw them, 200 head drifted up hard against the low fence with the wind behind them, packed in a great steaming, stinking huddle, snow crusting their backs, alive, most of them, saved by their own dumb instinct to put their tails to the storm and drift till the wire stopped them. And there, worked in among them, half sheltered by the bulk of them, we found Dunmore. But we did not at first find Prout. Dunmore was down. His horse had gone through the thin new lake ice at the flooded edge of the pasture in the white blindness and pitched him, and he'd come off hard with his leg broke below the knee. I could see the wrongness of it even in the dark and the snow, and he'd dragged himself, broke leg and all, up out of the freezing shallows and onto the bank and in among the cattle for what warmth their bodies threw, and he'd been lying there in the killing cold we could not even guess how long. He was gray. He was slow to know us. He was most of the way gone. And Prout was not with him, until Dunmore, teeth clacking so hard he could barely shape it, got out that the boy was there, right there, and we found him then, and the finding of it near broke me. Prout had reached Dunmore first, and Prout, young Prout, 20 years old, who 2 months back couldn't see the worth in a woman on account of her boots. Prout had taken off his own good coat and wrapped the older man in it, and given up his own warmth to a hurt man, and lain down against him to shield him from the wind with his own back. And by the time we got there the boy was nearly as far gone as the man he'd covered, blue-lipped and clumsy and slurring, so cold he laughed when he saw us. Which is the worst thing a freezing man can do. We got them up. God knows how, the 2 of us, but we got Dunmore up across his own horse that had come back to the herd, and we got Prout up too, and we wrapped them in Ruth's wool and poured the scalding coffee into them and got them turned for home. And then came the ride I'll not forget if I live to be 110, up the fence line in the black roar, one hand on the wire and the other holding a half-froze slurring man in his saddle, so he'd not slide off and be lost in 3 feet of white. One post, next post, next post. The wire our only thread out of the maze the whole world had become. It took us the better part of an hour to make a walk that would take 10 minutes in daylight. But we had the fence. We trusted the fence and we did not trust our eyes, and the fence walked us home, just as she'd said. And when we came up at last out of the storm into the yard, I'll tell you what I saw, and it stayed lit in my memory ever since. There was light in every single window of the halcyon house. Every one. She'd lit the whole place up like a lighthouse to be a mark for us in the white, the one warm gold thing in all that murdering dark. And the door flew open before we'd even properly stopped, and Adaline came out into that same killing wind, in her shirt sleeves, no coat, right down off the porch into the snow to get her hands under Dunmore and help us haul him down. What she did across the rest of that night I had been wishing for a doctor to do, and there was no doctor within 60 miles of hard country, and no way on God's earth to fetch one through that storm. So she did it. She'd read it, of course she had, in a book, some doctor's book out of that laughed. At Trunk we'd all judged her by. She knew a froze man mustn't be warmed too fast, that you bring him back slow or you kill him with the very fire meant to save him, and she governed the whole house by it, hard, not letting well-meaning fools crowd the men to the hearth. She knew how to draw the sodden boots and get warmth to the feet the right careful way. She set Dunmore's broken leg, set it clean, with me pulling the traction the way she told me and Teague holding the man's shoulders, and she splinted it. And I want you to hear what she splinted it with, because I have never gotten over it. She splinted Dunmore's broke leg with a long straight piece pried off the lid of her own book trunk. The trunk we'd laughed at, the books that wouldn't last a winter. A board off that very trunk went round a good man's leg and held the bone true, and held it well enough that Dunmore walked without so much as a limp to the end of his days. She worked over those two men from full dark to the first gray of dawn without once losing her steadiness or her sense, giving her orders in that voice that never shook, this here now, warm that slow, hold him so, and Teague did every single thing she told him. And so did I, two hard-grown men taking direction from the soft city bride without a flicker of a second thought, because in that room that night she was plainly and simply the one among us who knew. And a wise man in a crisis follows the one who knows and asks his questions after. And by the gray coming of the light both men were breathing deep and easy and warm, out of danger, going to keep their fingers and their toes and their lives, Dunmore going to keep his leg whole and Prout going to keep the pride of what he'd done out there for the rest of his years. And I looked up, sometime in that thin gray dawn, bone-weary, and I saw Elias Teague standing framed in the bedroom doorway looking at her. Looking at Adaline Vane, sleeves shoved to the elbow, hair long since come down out of its pins and hanging loose, those ink-stained, capable, unbeautiful, entirely beautiful working hands moving sure and gentle over a sleeping hurt man in the low lamplight, and the stone was gone off the man's face. Just gone. 3 years of it gone in the one night. He stood in that doorway and looked at his wife the way I had seen him look at exactly one other soul in all the years I'd known him, and that was his Ruth in the good days before the ground took her. And I knew, seeing it, that it was over. The bargain was over. The paper and the arrangement and the barn cot and the whole careful frozen distance the man had kept over, done, finished in the space of one blizzard. Elias Teague had gone and fallen clean in love with his own wife, which is a thing that happens out in that country more than a soft heart would credit, and is, I have always thought, one of the Almighty's kinder jokes on a hard man. He didn't say it that morning. It wasn't in him to say a thing like that fresh off a sleepless killing night over the bodies of 2 saved men. That wasn't Teague. But the storm blew itself out across the next 3 days, howling itself down to a mutter and then to nothing. And on the 3rd day the sun came up hard and blinding and clean over a world gone white and new and silent. Drifts curled like frozen waves against the north walls, the whole reached one sheet of dazzle. And that 3rd morning the Cranes came back. They'd only gone as far as they'd needed to sit out the storm's road, and now they came pouring back down onto the open water at the lake's thawed edge, thousands of them, gray against the white, and they lifted up that great wild rolling bugling calling all at once, the whole voice of the country come back in a rush, 10,000 throats of it rolling up over the reach in the cold, bright, still air. It was a sound to make the hair stand up on your arms. It always was. And Adaline stood out on the porch in the cold with a shawl around her, Ruth's shawl, the one she'd cleaned and mended and laid away and now taken up herself, and there was no wrongness in it, only a kind of rightness, the living going on with the love deads things, because grief that turns to gentleness is the only grief worth having. She stood there watching the birds come home. And Teague came around the corner of the house and found her there, and I was near enough, forking hay down for the horses, that I heard it, though I did my level best to look like a man wholly taken up with hay and hearing nothing at all. "Miss Vane," he said. And then he stopped, because he'd been calling her Miss Vane for the better part of 2 months, and it was, all of a sudden, wholly and completely the wrong thing, and he knew it, and he stood there and hunted for the right thing. He started over. "Adaline." "Mr. Teague." "Elias," he said. "If you'd, I'd take it kindly, if you'd call me Elias." She turned from the cranes and looked at him, and she waited quiet and let him find the rest of it himself, because she was not a woman to do a man's hard saying for him. "I wrote for a working woman," Teague said. He had his hat off and in his 2 hands, and he was turning it round and round by the brim the way a man will when the thing he's got to get said is a great deal bigger than his whole store of words to say it with. "That first day, standing right down there by the yard gate, I looked at you and I told you to your face I didn't think you were what I wrote for. I said it kind as I could, but I said it, and I was going to put you on the Thursday coach and call it mercy." He drew a breath. "I have been wrong about a good many things these 3 years past, Adaline. Wrong about near everything, I expect, since I let this place and myself go to stone over a grave. But I don't believe I have ever in my life been so entirely wrong about one thing as I was wrong about you, standing there in the wind that first afternoon judging a whole soul by a pair of thin boots." He looked out at the lake, at the birds, at the dazzle, and back at her. "You caught a thief 3 grown men missed. You walked me down a fence line in a blizzard with your own good sense and saved 2 men's lives by it and set a bone by a book, and lit this whole house up gold so we'd have a mark to steer home by. And you did all of it after a country full of fools, myself the biggest of them, told you to your face you wouldn't last 1 winter. He stopped. His voice had gone rough. "We're married on paper. I know that. I know it started a bargain and a cold one in my doing. But I find I don't want it to be a bargain any longer, and I've got no earthly right to ask you for more than the bargain, but I'm asking. I'd have it be real. I'd have you if you'd have a hard, grieving, foolish old man who took 2 months and near a whole man frozen to death to see what was standing right in front of him the entire time. I'd marry you again, Adaline, and mean every word of it this time, before that snow's off the ground. And Adaline Vane, who had buried a father and a mother and a brother, who had kept a blind man's books and paid a dead man's debts alone, who had crossed 2,000 miles of a hard country to a place that laughed at her boots before she'd even got them dirty, who had never once in the whole of her hard life been permitted the luxury of being taken for what she truly was, Adaline Vane smiled. It was the first true, whole, unguarded smile I'd seen out of her in the 2 months she'd been among us. It came up slow, and it lit her entire face, and it changed her. And it was, I tell you, worth every hard day of the waiting. "Elias Teague," she said, "I have been reading your accounts for 2 months now, every column front to back, and I have found in all those pages one figure you never once entered, not once, though it is the only figure in the whole book that was ever worth the ink." She stepped in close to him there in the crane-loud, blinding, cold, bright morning. "Your own worth. What you're worth, Elias, to this place and to the men on it and to me. You've spent 3 years so bent over grieving what you lost that you never once got out your pen and tallied what you'd kept, what you still had whole, to give a person. And a man who won't tally his own worth will let the whole rest of his life get shaved off him a few pounds at a time and never catch the thief. And the thief's name is grief. And it is patient, Elias, and it will take everything if you let it, a little at a time, because you're too tired to check." She reached out and laid that ink-stained hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you. I didn't come here to be loved, I came to work. And I mean to work this place beside you till I'm as gray and weathered and useless as Harlan there behind us, pretending to fork hay and hearing every single word. I coughed and studied the mountains with great attention. "But I will not be married one more day to a bargain," she said. "So marry me true, Elias, before the snow melts, just as you say. And do this one thing for me that no book taught me and I only learned from watching you nearly waste your whole good heart. Enter your own worth in the ledger for once in your life. Write it down. And let me be the one who checks your figures from here on out. I'm very good at it, you've seen." And Elias Teague laughed. I had not heard the man laugh in 3 years, and it came up out of him rusty and startled and shaking, like an old dry pump that's finally, against all hope, caught water. And once it caught, it kept coming, and there were tears standing bright in the man's hard eyes with it, though he'd have called them wind. He took that plain, ink-stained hand up off his chest and folded it into both his own big, weathered ones, and held it there against his heart like it was the single most valuable thing on the whole broad Sweetwater reach, which by then I had come entirely to understand it was. They married again that same week, before the snow was off even the north slopes, the circuit parson riding out through the last soft rotting drifts to do it proper. And the whole reach came, the very same country that had sworn a stack of oaths she wouldn't last her first winter came crowding into the halcyon's warm, bright front room, the room she'd swept and lit and brought back from the dead, to stand witness to the winter she had already, plainly and entirely, outlasted. Prout cried. He'd deny it to his grave and beyond, but the boy cried like a spring creek in a thaw, standing there whole and warm because she'd known to bring him back slow. Dunmore stood up straight on his mendied leg, mendied by a board off a book trunk, to see it done, and never sat back down till it was finished. Coleman was not asked, and did not come, and troubled the halcyon no more. And I kept the tally book that day, brother, same as I'd kept it 30 years, and I'll tell you the same true thing I told you clear at the start of all this. I never wrote down the thing that mattered. You can't. That's the whole plain fact of a ledger, and the whole reason an old man who spent his life keeping one has got to sit here and tell you the rest of it out loud with his mouth, since the book won't hold it. A ledger holds cattle and coin and the price of nails. It does not hold the sound of a coach coming up a grade in hard afternoon light, with your whole unlived life sitting inside it in a dove-gray dress and thin town boots. It does not hold the sight of a man made of 3 years of stone learning, in one blizzard, how to laugh again. And it surely does not, it cannot, hold what it is to stand in a barn door forking hay, and watch a woman a whole country wrote clean off at a single careless glance turn, out to be the truest and the bravest, and the best heart the halcyon ever gained or ever would. They ran that place better than 40 years together. She kept the books to the very last day of her life, and she never once, not one single time, let Elias Teague slip an untallied figure past her, in the ledger or out of it. And every spring, when the cranes came pouring back down out of the north onto that high still water and lifted up their great wild rolling call over the reach, I'd catch the two of them, old and gray and weathered as fence posts the both of them by then, standing out on that same porch where he'd asked her true, her ink-stained hand folded into his weathered one, the pair of them just standing, watching the wild birds come home to the lake. The birds that knew, that first strange, warm October morning, the thing that not one of the rest of us had the wit to know. That she would last a great deal more than one winter. That she would, in the end, outlast them all, and light the whole place gold doing it.